There's a specific pattern almost everyone hopes to eventually witness after surviving a narcissistic relationship. The downfall, the moment consequences finally catch up, the satisfying confirmation that patterns this destructive cannot continue indefinitely without eventual visible cost. Today, we're going to trace what this downfall actually realistically tends to look like, separating genuine, likely outcomes from the more dramatic fantasy version many people quietly hope for but rarely actually receive. Let's start with something crucial to establish before tracing specific expectations. Downfall, when it genuinely occurs, rarely looks like the dramatic public reckoning popular imagination often constructs. Understanding this distinction matters enormously for managing your own expectations in a way that protects your peace rather than setting you up for ongoing disappointment while you wait for something considerably more theatrical than what actually typically unfolds. What to expect: gradual invisible erosion rather than sudden visible collapse. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the structural nature of narcissistic psychology: the dependence on external supply, the incapacity for genuine self-reflection, the narrative management required to maintain a curated self-image. Downfall, when it genuinely occurs, typically manifests as the slow, accumulating cost of these structural limitations, rather than as a single dramatic event that produces satisfying, visible public consequence. This looks like relationships that consistently fail to reach genuine depth, professional relationships that erode over time as colleagues gradually recognize patterns that were initially obscured by charm, a widening gap between his curated public image and the private reputation gradually developing among people who've had sustained, direct experience with him. What to expect: relationships becoming progressively shorter and more superficial over time, rather than genuine isolation. This connects to something we traced extensively throughout our conversation about supply diversification. Downfall doesn't typically manifest as complete isolation because his psychology remains genuinely skilled at securing new sources of engagement, at least initially. What actually tends to develop instead is a pattern worth understanding clearly: relationships that increasingly fail to reach the depth and duration his earlier relationships achieved. Partners who recognize the underlying patterns considerably faster than partners did earlier in his life. A widening reputation among people who eventually compare notes and recognize the consistency of what they each individually experienced. What to expect: professional consequences that develop slowly, often over years, rather than dramatic, immediate exposure. Remember what we discussed about narrative management requiring continuous, exhausting effort to sustain. Professional environments often provide a specific kind of long-term consequence worth understanding. Colleagues who initially found him charming and capable gradually accumulating enough direct experience to recognize underlying patterns, opportunities that become harder to secure as reputation gradually shifts. Professional relationships that consistently fail to develop into the kind of trusted senior positions that require sustained collaborative trust rather than simply initial charm and confidence. What to expect: the specific private cost we traced extensively throughout our conversation about the quiet costs a narcissist is already paying, never experiencing genuine intimacy, regardless of how his external life appears. This remains arguably the most consistent and most significant downfall available, precisely because it operates continuously and doesn't depend on external circumstances, eventually producing visible consequence. He will never know what it feels like to be fully known by another person and to experience safety rather than threat in that knowing. Regardless of how many relationships he moves through, regardless of how successful his external life continues to appear, let's continue tracing what genuine downfall actually tends to include, moving into territory that addresses something important many people specifically hope to witness, even when they intellectually understand that dramatic public exposure remains statistically rare. What to expect: occasional, partial exposure through specific relationships rather than comprehensive public reckoning. Remember what we traced extensively throughout our conversation about betraying a super empath permanently. Sometimes, though not always, a specific person emerges from his relational history whose perception proves genuinely resistant to his usual narrative management, whose account of what actually happened carries enough credibility and enough specificity that it does eventually circulate meaningfully among mutual connections. This represents a genuine, though partial and inconsistent form of downfall, not comprehensive public exposure, but localized erosion of his reputation within specific social circles where someone's accurate account happened to reach people genuinely positioned to recognize and believe it. This matters for calibrating realistic expectations because it explains why some people do eventually witness meaningful reputational consequence, while others watch a former partner seem to continue thriving indefinitely without any visible cost at all. The variable isn't simply how much harm he caused or how genuinely he deserves consequence. It's whether circumstances happen to produce a specific, credible witness whose account reached people genuinely positioned to act on it, combined with whether his specific pattern of harm happened to occur in contexts where consequence was actually enforceable, legal, professional, or socially significant enough to produce genuine, lasting reputational cost. What to expect? His own internal experience of downfall, considerably more consistent than any external, visible version. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about narcissistic breakdown following permanent loss, about the crisis of predictive competence, about the comparison anxiety that develops when new partners fail to replicate what previous relationships provided. This internal downfall, while genuinely real and genuinely significant, remains almost entirely invisible to outside observation, which means it typically cannot serve as the satisfying, visible confirmation many people specifically hope to witness. He may be genuinely struggling, genuinely confronting the accumulating cost of his own psychological limitations, while his external presentation continues appearing successful and unaffected to anyone observing from outside, including potentially you. This distinction matters enormously for your own expectations, because it means the downfall you might most reasonably expect to actually witness, external, visible, socially confirmed consequence, represents the least reliable and least consistent version of everything we've traced today, while the most reliable and most consistent version, internal, structural, permanent limitation in his capacity for genuine connection and lasting satisfaction, remains largely invisible, something you'll likely never receive direct confirmation of witnessing at all. What to expect? Your own peace arriving considerably before and considerably independent of any confirmed downfall on his side. This is worth naming directly as the most realistic, most achievable expectation available, one that connects to everything we've traced throughout this entire series about detachment being the only thing that actually works. If you're currently waiting for confirmed downfall as a prerequisite for your own genuine peace, understand that this waiting, based on everything we've traced today about how inconsistent and often invisible genuine downfall actually tends to be, could genuinely extend indefinitely, potentially for the rest of your life, without ever receiving the confirmation you're hoping to eventually witness. This matters enormously for how you actually structure your own expectations and your own healing timeline. The realistic path forward was never actually built on waiting for his downfall to become visible and confirmed. It was always built on the internal work we've traced throughout dozens of previous conversations in this series. Grief, rebuilt self-trust, genuine detachment, proceeding entirely independent of whatever happens or doesn't happen to become visible on his side of this equation. Here's something crucial worth understanding about why calibrating these realistic expectations actually serves you better than the more dramatic fantasy version, even though it might initially feel less satisfying to accept. If your peace depends on eventually witnessing dramatic, confirmed downfall, You've built your own well-being on a foundation that remains genuinely outside your control and, based on everything we've traced today, statistically unreliable even over very long time frames. If your peace depends instead on your own continued healing and your own continued life, regardless of whatever downfall he does or doesn't eventually experience, you've built something considerably more reliable, something that genuinely, completely belongs to you, regardless of how his story ultimately unfolds. Because here's what all of this ultimately needs to lead toward. And it's worth being direct about it rather than leaving this conversation as simply a realistic recalibration of expectations without addressing what genuinely, practically matters most. How to actually hold these expectations in a way that protects your peace, and what to do with whatever complicated feelings arise from accepting that dramatic, confirmed downfall may never actually arrive in the form you've been hoping for. The first thing worth understanding clearly is that accepting this realistic picture doesn't require abandoning any sense that justice matters, or pretending you don't care whether he ever faces genuine consequence for what he did. Remember what we discussed throughout our conversation about disrespect that should never be forgiven. The distinction between releasing your own emotional weight and pretending what happened was somehow acceptable or excusable. You can hold complete, permanent clarity that he deserves genuine consequence, that what happened to you was genuinely wrong, that justice in some cosmic sense would absolutely include real accountability and real cost for his behavior, while simultaneously releasing your own need to witness this justice personally, directly, and confirmed in order for your own peace to feel complete. This distinction matters enormously because it protects you from a specific trap, believing that accepting the realistic, often invisible nature of genuine downfall somehow requires you to minimize what happened, or to pretend indifference toward whether he ever faces consequence. You're allowed to hold both things simultaneously: genuine conviction that he deserves real accountability, and genuine release of your own need to personally witness that accountability arriving in order to move forward with your own life. Here's the second thing worth understanding, one that addresses something important about how grief specifically relates to this particular kind of acceptance. Remember what we've traced throughout this entire series about the various forms of grief that accompany healing from narcissistic relationships. Grief for the relationship itself, grief for lost time, grief for the self-trust that was eroded and had to be rebuilt. Accepting that dramatic, confirmed downfall may never actually arrive introduces its own specific grief worth acknowledging directly rather than rushing past. There's a genuine loss in releasing the fantasy of eventual, satisfying vindication, a fantasy that likely provided real comfort during some of the hardest parts of your healing process, even if you always understood, intellectually, that it might never actually materialize. Give this grief genuine space rather than immediately replacing it with the more mature, more accepting understanding we've traced throughout today's conversation. It's genuinely difficult to release the hope of eventually watching someone face visible consequence for harm they caused you, and pretending this release happens easily or without genuine loss misrepresents what this process actually requires. Allow yourself to feel disappointed, even angry, that the world doesn't always provide the clean, visible justice it probably should, before moving toward whatever genuine acceptance eventually develops from sitting honestly with this disappointment rather than bypassing it entirely. Here's the third thing worth understanding, one that offers something genuinely constructive to hold on to once this grief has been given its proper space. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about what your own transformation actually represents, independent of anything happening to him. The genuine downfall we discussed in the first two parts of this conversation, his structural incapacity for genuine intimacy, his relationships becoming progressively shorter and more superficial, his internal crisis of predictive competence, represents real, genuine cost, even when it remains largely invisible to you specifically. This cost is happening, is real, and doesn't require your direct observation in order to be genuinely true. You're allowed to hold quiet confidence that this cost exists and continues accumulating without requiring confirmation of it in order to feel settled about releasing your own need to personally witness it. Here's the fourth thing worth understanding, one that circles back to something we've emphasized throughout this entire series in countless different forms. The actual, most reliable form of justice available to you was never actually his downfall at all. It was always your own recovery, your own genuine healing, your own genuine capacity to build a life so complete and so fulfilling that his continued existence, whatever shape it eventually takes, simply stops mattering to your own sense of wholeness. This isn't a consolation prize offered because the more satisfying version of justice remains unreliable and often invisible. It's actually the more significant, more lasting form of justice available, precisely because it belongs entirely to you, doesn't depend on circumstances you cannot control, and doesn't require witnessing anything happening to him in order to become genuinely, permanently real. Here's the fifth and final thing worth understanding, the piece that ultimately matters most as we close this entire conversation. If you find yourself, months or years from now, occasionally still wondering what's happened to him, occasionally still hoping some piece of information might eventually confirm the downfall we've traced throughout today's discussion, understand that this wondering doesn't represent failure or incomplete healing. It represents simply being human, having survived something genuinely significant, and retaining some natural curiosity about how that story eventually resolves, even while your own life has moved considerably beyond needing that resolution in order to feel complete. What matters isn't achieving complete permanent absence of any curiosity about his downfall. What matters is that your own life, your own healing, your own genuine wholeness no longer requires that downfall's confirmation in order to exist fully and completely, regardless of whether it ever becomes visible to you at all. This is the realistic, achievable, and ultimately more valuable outcome available to you. Not certainty about his eventual downfall, but genuine confidence in your own, already accomplished, considerably more significant transformation. One that remains entirely, permanently yours, regardless of how his story continues unfolding on the other side of a life you've already correctly reclaimed as your own. Regardless of how his story continues unfolding on the other side of a life you've already correctly reclaimed as your own. There's one more dimension worth examining here, because it addresses a specific question that often surfaces once someone has genuinely absorbed everything we've traced throughout this entire conversation. If visible, confirmed downfall is genuinely rare, and if the more reliable forms of consequence remain largely invisible. Does this mean the entire concept of what goes around comes around is simply wishful thinking, something people tell themselves to feel better without any genuine basis in reality? This question deserves a careful, honest answer, because oversimplifying it in either direction, either promising guaranteed cosmic justice or dismissing the concept entirely as pure fantasy, misrepresents something more nuanced worth understanding clearly. Here's the honest, careful answer. The structural costs we've traced throughout this entire conversation, the incapacity for genuine intimacy, the progressively shorter and more superficial relationships, the internal crisis of predictive competence, the exhausting narrative management required to sustain a curated self-image. These aren't wishful thinking. They're direct, logical consequences of the psychological architecture we've examined extensively throughout this entire series. Consequences that follow as reliably as any cause and effect relationship in human psychology. What isn't reliable, what genuinely does remain largely a matter of circumstance and chance, is whether these consequences ever become visible to you specifically, whether they ever produce the kind of dramatic, socially confirmed reckoning that would feel satisfying to witness directly. This distinction matters because it allows you to hold something genuinely true, that real structural consequence does exist and does accumulate, without requiring the additional, less reliable belief that this consequence will necessarily become visible, confirmed, or witnessed by you personally. The universe, in whatever sense that concept means anything at all, doesn't owe you a front row seat to his downfall in exchange for your own healing. But the downfall itself, in the structural, internal sense we've traced throughout this conversation, remains genuinely real, regardless of whether you ever receive that front row seat. Here's something worth understanding about a specific danger that can develop if this distinction isn't held clearly. The risk of becoming someone who needs to believe in guaranteed, visible cosmic justice so strongly that any evidence of him appearing to thrive produces genuine distress or genuine doubt about your own healing. If you encounter him through whatever channel, appearing genuinely successful, genuinely happy, genuinely unaffected by whatever internal struggle we've traced throughout this entire conversation, remember that external appearance and internal reality can diverge considerably, and remember also that even if his internal reality genuinely does include more contentment than you might expect, this doesn't retroactively change what he did to you, doesn't diminish your own genuine right to have expected better treatment, and doesn't require you to reinterpret your own experience simply because his current life doesn't match the downfall narrative you might have hoped to eventually witness. This is worth stating directly because it protects you from a specific, painful trap. Allowing his apparent thriving, whether genuine or simply well performed, to reopen questions about your own worth or your own judgment throughout the relationship. His current state, whatever it genuinely is, was never actually evidence about whether you deserved better treatment than you received. It's simply information about his current circumstances. Information that exists entirely separate from the validity of your own experience and your own right to have expected genuine care and genuine respect throughout the time you spent together. Here's a final thought worth carrying forward from this entire conversation, one that ties together everything we've traced across all three parts. The word inevitable in this conversation's original title deserves one final, honest examination. Downfall, in the structural sense we've spent this entire discussion tracing, genuinely is inevitable, in the sense that psychological architecture built around external validation and structural incapacity for genuine intimacy simply cannot produce lasting, genuine satisfaction, regardless of external circumstances. This inevitability is real and reliable. What isn't inevitable, what remains genuinely uncertain and largely outside anyone's control, is whether this downfall ever becomes visible, confirmed, or witnessed in the specific way that would feel satisfying from the outside. Holding both truths simultaneously, genuine confidence in the structural inevitability of internal cost, combined with genuine acceptance that visible confirmation may never arrive, represents the most accurate, most sustainable way to carry this entire conversation forward into your own continued life. You don't need to abandon your belief that consequences exist. You simply need to release your requirement that you personally witness them in order to consider your own story complete. Your story was always complete the moment you chose to leave, the moment you chose genuine healing over continued hope, the moment you began building a life that genuinely, fully belongs to you, regardless of what continues unfolding, visibly or invisibly, in the life of someone whose story no longer requires your continued attention in order to have already genuinely mattered.